All right. Well, welcome everyone to our spotlight session, Recovery on the Horizon, International Student Demand to the US. My name is Ellie Butler. I am head of marketing for North America here at IDP Connect. Prior to this role, I worked at universities for 9 years, King's College and Temple University. And now that I am with IDP Connect, I'm excited to be able to work with so many institutions and help connect international students to the right universities. I'm very pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Jonah Duffin, Director of External Relations at IDP Connect, who similarly has a background working in universities in the UK. And I'm sure, like many of you, last year's AIEA conference was actually the last in-person conference we attended before the world changed as we know it. So while I am excited to be able to connect with all of you virtually today, I'm very much looking forward to when we can be in person with you again at future AIEA conferences when it is safe to do so. So throughout the presentation, we ask that all participants remain muted. The session is being recorded and AIEA will make the recording and the slides available to you all following the conference. And we also encourage you to ask questions throughout using the question and answer tool. So on the next slide, I'd just like to introduce IDP Connect for those of you who may not know us. IDP Connect is your gateway to the largest connected community of international students in the world. We are the institution-facing arm of IDP Education, which you may know as a world leader in international student placement services and digital recruitment solutions. We are also proud co-owners of IELTS, English Language Test. We have a physical network of student-facing offices in over 30 countries, pictured here in the dark orange, and we send students to major English-speaking destination countries, pictured here in the yellow. We have over 900 counselors throughout this network, so we are truly embedded within the markets in which we operate, and students really trust the IDP name. Alongside this physical network, we also have the largest digital presence of any international student service provider across our websites and our mobile app. We operate 33 student-facing sites across Hot Courses and IDP.com. And this map here highlights the Hot Courses sites across the globe, which are all locally hosted. So you can see the .br there for Brazil, the .vn for Vietnam. And because we have access to the largest community of international students in the world, with over 100 million annual visits to these websites, we subsequently hold the largest combined data set on international student behavior in the world. And this includes all sorts of international student behavior online, what they're searching for, what kind of actions they're taking, which countries and programs are in demand, and so on. So pictured here is student demand volume over the past year of students who were searching for institutions in the US. So we can see large volumes of international students in India, Turkey, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and so on. And I do want to note that for the purposes of this presentation, we've excluded China from the data. And that is because China students are not using our sites in the same way that all these other markets are. So the tendency for students in China is to rely on direct relationships with agents, and their top of the funnel research is taking place primarily on WeChat. So the relative traffic from China on our sites isn't rich enough to represent full Chinese student demand. However, we do have a vast network of offices across China, and we'd be happy to chat with you afterwards if you're interested in recruiting more Chinese students. So again, what makes us really unique is the depth of live data that we have from our online sites, coupled with the global insights of our physical network, which makes us unparalleled in terms of what we can offer. So what do we mean when we say live data? Well, because we're able to see students' online behavior in real time, we can see immediate changes and fluctuations in their behavior, which is especially fascinating when it comes to things like geopolitical factors, policy announcements and changes, and how all of these things affect student demand. So while historical sources of data, such as open doors and where your applications and inquiries have come from in the past, are certainly important, it is also critical to look at real-time prospective student data, which can help you to track fluctuations in student behavior and help you identify new markets for recruitment, travel, and marketing investments. So just quickly before we jump into the meat of the presentation and show you the exciting data changes that we have recently seen, I just want to quickly provide some more context on what students are seeing on their end on our sites. So based on our annual student buyer behavior research, we know that students are starting their college research process with broad online searches for programs that they're interested in or destination information. They typically have an idea of what program they want to study, so they conduct searches online to find institutions that offer what they're looking for and which of these institutions pique their interest. So if a student does a Google search for study engineering in the USA, your institution's website is not popping up in those results. Rather, it is college search aggregators that feature institutional profiles. And because we are student first, we feature all institutions on our sites, not just those who partner with us. Of course, those that partner with us do have much more enhanced profiles. This is an example of Virginia Tech's profile here on the right. So just as you and I might use Yelp to find the best restaurants and Expedia to compare hotels, students use college search sites to research and compare institutions and explore their content. So prospective students can shortlist their favorite universities, submit inquiries, navigate to your institution's website. And as I mentioned, we are receiving over 100 million visits per year on these sites from students. So we know that this is where they're conducting their research, and we have a wealth of data on their behavior there. So with that context, I'd say it's time to jump into the data and share with you some of the insights on international student searches to the US. So I will pass to my colleague, Jonah, who will walk us through some of that.
Thank you for that introduction, Ellie, and good evening, everybody. I'm joining you from London, England, so it's very nice to be here. The last time I left the country was to visit this conference last year, so it certainly feels like longer than a year ago. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is talk you through some of the demand data that we're seeing. So as Ellie has said, we have all of that data coming out of our websites, and we can see what students are doing and when they're doing it. And we can see what subjects they're looking at, and we can see what universities and what countries they're looking at and where they're from. So that data that we're getting from those websites forms much of this presentation. So if we move on to the next slide, excuse me. So this is looking at data from September 2020 through till the 8th of February, so just over a week ago. And what we can see is that the US, which is the orange line towards the top of the page, was tracking round about third place. So behind the UK and behind Canada, but some way above Australia and Malaysia. And if we put on another destination, that would be New Zealand. And we can see that as we get to around about the 16th of November last year, that it really begins to track upwards. It drops away slightly just around the middle of December, and then again tracks back up, overtaking the UK and moving into second place. So we really see a clear upturn from all of that 100 million traffic to our site in students from around the world looking to study at the US, a real recovery in their numbers from what we've seen in previous years. And we know that back in September, the UK made a big play in terms of its post-study work visa, so making sure that students were able to work once they'd finished their degree in the UK. We also know they made a number of announcements around how they were dealing with the pandemic and how welcome students would be to the UK. And you can see that kind of uptick to the left-hand side of the chart, but you can see the UK still, despite all of that, and despite being open during the pandemic and welcoming students, falling to second place on our sites in terms of popularity of destination market. So having presented for a long time on global student demand, this is one of the few times in the recent history that I've been able to talk to an audience in the US and give what I hope is some good positive news about how the US is tracking. So looking really good from this slide. So how does that that demand break down? Well, we've got just under 65% of those who were using our sites were looking for postgraduate courses, and just over a third looking for undergraduate, and then a sort of insignificant amount looking for vocational. So just to reassure you that these are real students looking at real undergraduate and postgraduate courses. So we then delved deeper into the data and began to look at the top 5 subject areas that those looking at the US were searching for. And what we see is you've got around a quarter of all of those searching were looking at health and medicine courses. Again, this is over the last 12 months. And then we've got business and administrative studies at around 13.5%, matching that with applied and pure sciences, followed by engineering, technology, social studies and communication. So I think if you were to compare that to other data for other key destination countries, you would see a similar trend. There's nothing exceptional being pulled out here for the US, but as a US audience, want to know who's interested in what for you. But yeah, you would see the same if you looked at Australia and the UK recently. There has been a real growth in the number of students looking for health and medicine courses, and then business and admin and sciences remain popular for students using our sites looking to study overseas. So looking at source markets, so where are the students who are looking at the US? Where are they based? Where do they live? What nationality are they? Where, in which countries is the US seeing particular interest coming from? So we're going to take a look at the source markets and look at it in country level. I've been practicing this with the animation all day and never quite got it right. But as you can see, we've got Brazil up at the top, followed by Turkey and Indonesia. You see Turkey going up, Indonesia going down, India coming up, Brazil receding slightly, Turkey continuing to grow in terms of popularity, and then Turkey finally overtaking Brazil and India into second place. I feel like I'm commentating on a horse race. And so what's interesting here is that you can see throughout 2020 and into the beginning of 21, that there is real change, that there is real fluctuation in where that demand is coming from, and really big increases from Turkey, with Brazil still very much a key market for the US, and India as well, really coming on strong, which is traditionally a strong market for Canada and for the UK as well. I think if we look slightly further down, bring your attention towards the bottom of that chart, and you can see there's quite interesting shuffling going on there as well. We're seeing Southeast Asia, so Vietnam and Thailand. We're also seeing Mexico and some of the other South American countries such as Colombia, who are consistently on that leaderboard, and an appearance from Peru from August 2020 onwards. There's also some activity there from Russia and Saudi Arabia, moving between sort of 6th and 10th place as well. So just shows that throughout the year, we're really seeing fluctuation in demand, but that top 10 remaining relatively stable. So then if we break that down even further and drill into the data a little bit more, we can see health and medicine, which was by far the most popular subject area. A lot of that demand is coming from Brazil, India and Turkey, and then drops off significantly into Indonesia and China. You can see as well that top for applied and pure sciences, it swaps over. So if you were looking to really promote your science courses, India is showing the highest rates of demand throughout the last year for applied and pure sciences, as well as for engineering and technology. Brazil for the softer subjects of social studies and communications, and then India back into first place for business and administrative studies, followed by Brazil and Indonesia in third place. The other thing just to pull out on that slide as well is that Turkey is also key for health and medicine, but very much falling down to 5th place for business and administrative studies. So again, this data is really important in looking at which courses are going to market best where. and again, seeing changes in terms of where demand is and where you're best going to be able to promote and market your courses to which audiences. So we then looked at where we were seeing the most growth and demand growing for the US. Interestingly, Turkey saw the highest growth, and we saw that in the animated slide earlier, that Turkey moving up that leaderboard throughout the year. Very interestingly as well, you've got Cuba with growth of just under 30%, Iran growing by a fifth, and Yemen and Panama. So seeing real interest and quite significant growth from Middle Eastern countries, and then also from Panama and Cuba as well. So it's also interesting to understand that and to see where the emerging markets are and where you can begin to capitalize on growing or emerging demand where possibly you hadn't thought of looking previously. So then finally, before I hand back over to Ellie to go through this in even more granular detail from a US point of view, just break down where that growth is going to in terms of the US. So whether it's the North US, Western parts of the country, South or Midwest. And you can really see that Turkey is number one across all of those regions. So Turkey not dominating one part of the US in terms of demand. However, if you look to, for example, the South, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that Indonesia is showing real growth in terms of those states, whereas it doesn't function, doesn't show at all in any of the other areas of the US. You've got Germany sneaking into the Midwest and not showing up in any of the others. And then you've got Cuba in second place for all, but not for the Midwest. So again, depending on where your university is located, we're seeing variations in demand and where that demand is coming from in the world. So that was a quite a detailed but brief run through of some of the data that we're seeing on our sites and that growing demand for the US, where it's coming from and for which courses. Now I'm going to hand back over to Ellie, who will talk you through some of that demand and how it plays out at a state and a regional level.
Thank you so much, Jonah, and really exciting to see the upturn in student demand. A reminder, because we had a couple questions coming in, this is looking at demand from our websites. If you missed the beginning of the presentation, we operate a number of student-facing websites where students conduct research comparing institutions. We receive over 100 million visits per year. So this is data collected from those websites, just at how you might look at Google Analytics to determine traffic for your website. We have all of the traffic to our student-facing sites. So we're going to take a look at some state and regional demand now. I do want to quickly note that this is a visual representation of the data generated by Tableau. So we know that Washington, D.C. is not located out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and we know that Virginia is not landlocked. But what this visual representation does show us is student demand volume by state. The darker the color of the hexagon, the higher volume of student searches and actions for that state. So of course, much of this is consistent with Open Doors enrollment data. We know international students favor California and New York, so no surprise there to see them as the darkest colored hexagons. We're also seeing significant volume to Massachusetts, Texas, Florida, Virginia, and Connecticut. So this could be something interesting for study state consortia to take a look at, to benchmark state demand and develop strategies to boost student demand to your state. And on the next slide, we will look at student demand to the different states on a leaderboard. So this is the leaderboard for searches across our sites in 2020. So once again, no major surprises in the top spots, with California and New York leading the way. I was a little disappointed that my home state of Pennsylvania did not crack the top 10. So if your state is in this list, congratulations, because you were in the top 20% of states in demand for international students on our websites throughout 2020. And when we look at this from a regional breakdown, we're looking at 4 primary regions, And this is based on the regions that US News and World Report uses to break down institutions across the US for their regional rankings. So we're looking at the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the West. And again, looking at student demand, we can see here larger volumes for Southern California, large volumes for the Miami area in Florida, and of course, the major Northeastern cities. And when we look at regional demand on the leaderboard, next slide here, we see that the North is leading the way for student demand across these regions, with the West and the Midwest quite close together, followed by the South coming in last place. So again, this is for student demand throughout 2020 on our websites. So plenty of opportunities for things to change in the future. And what causes these changes and what influences student demand? Well, on a global scale, it's especially fascinating to see the impact of geopolitical factors and policy changes on student demand. So I will pass it over to Jonah, who will discuss more on that. I think you are muted, Jonah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yeah, if we have a look at this data, we're going to have a look and see if we can try and make some correlation and possibly causation into some of the rises and falls that we've seen in demand over the last year. So if we move on to the next slide, here we're looking at demand from the top 3 source countries searching for the US. So if you were listening carefully earlier, you'll know that was Brazil, India, and Turkey. And we're looking at searches from January 2020 through to the 8th of February 2021. So as I said earlier, just over a week ago. And 2 events in particular that I want to call your attention to. So the first is the drop in demand following COVID hitting the US in March and the WHO declaring that global pandemic. And then the second is the significant growth in demand following the results of the 2020 presidential election in the US. And we see particularly for Turkey that this seemed to generate a significant spike in interest in studying in the US as that election result became clearer, culminating in a very large spike towards the end of December 2020. You also can see Brazil, again, declining throughout the pandemic, and then beginning from very late in December and early January into February, beginning to bounce back, but still not quite recovered the levels that it was at back in the first quarter of 2020 last year. And then finally, we have India, which saw a drop in March and has then plateaued along through till beginning to mid-November, after which it begins to recover and is looking to maybe recover back up to the point that it was at the beginning of 2020. So what we're seeing is that, you know, it feels like that the back end of 2020 was a real point in the year where demand seemed to recover from these key markets, and that correlates with the election of Joe Biden as president of the United States. So you can see that possibly you can put those 2 together and say that that's what's driving increased demand from students to the US. So if we look at this same time period, but we look at it at city level, we can see that much of that demand from Turkey comes from Istanbul, which is the top sort of dark pink line, followed by Ankara, which is the green line. So that's really what's driving the increase in demand or interest in the US is from those 2 cities. If we look then to where it's coming from in terms of India, we've got Hyderabad there as one of the key drivers of growth. And you can see that growth actually begins from around middle of July and has consistently grown week on week up until the 8th of February. So just to sort of highlight that, again, there is in the granularity of the data, there is differences, and it's really important to be looking at this granular level to see where that demand is coming from. So this again is another interesting slide. Again, we're looking at that same time frame of January last year through to 8th of February this year, and we're looking now at India in particular. And what we see from the data from students using our sites from India is we see a really significant dip to from end of February into early March, and that is when the global pandemic hit and when it was declared by the WHO. On top of this, India cancelled the processing of student and academic visas starting on March the 16th and continuing through to August. And that represents the grey block, the grey shading that you see there on the slide. So we see during that period a significant dip in demand as students weren't feeling particularly optimistic, or that there was a practical expectation that they could travel to study in the US. But then as you begin to see that cancelling of the processing of student visas lifted towards the end of August, you then see demand slowly begin to pick up, for it drops in mid-October before then recovering more significantly and nearly back up to those pre-pandemic levels throughout the end of 2020 and into the beginning of 2021. So again, here in March, we see a large spike in demand following the 2020 elections as well. And that's just mapped on top of that visa processing issue as well, and seeing how that possibly has had an impact on students' optimism and reality in terms of studying at the US. So with that, I will pass back to Ellie.
Thanks so much, Jonah. Really interesting to see the direct impact of elections and policy changes on student study intentions and search behavior. So on a similar note, I am elated to share with you today a preview of survey results that will be officially published next week. Because we have access to the world's largest community of international students at IDP Connect, we're able to tap into this network of students to run surveys and collect student feedback on a number of topics. So you may be familiar with our Crossroads research that surveyed students on how COVID affected their study plans. I think someone pasted a link to one of our press releases into the chat. So we ran that survey 3 times within the past year. But we wanted to conduct a new one this year, and we wanted to understand how international students who were considering the US as a study destination felt about the results of the 2020 election and whether or not it affected their likelihood to study in the US. So we conducted a 7-minute online survey between January 22nd, which was just following Inauguration Day, until February 3rd. And we surveyed prospective international students who were considering the US as a study destination. We received over 800 participants from over 40 countries. 51% of these students were interested in postgraduate programs, 30% in undergrad programs, and 19% in English language and pre-university programs. And featured here on the right, we have a free text response on the survey from an undergraduate student from India who said, "I really hope that the results of the election help students like me to move to America and pursue our dreams." So again, just sharing a preview of the survey results here. So for the question, how has your perception of the United States changed as a result of the 2020 US presidential election? 76% of international students said their perception of the US has improved following the results of the 2020 presidential election. 17% said their perceptions remain the same, and 7% said their perceptions had worsened. Again, we have another free text response from a prospective postgrad student from Nigeria who says, "With this new administration, the United States will favor citizens of my country to study appropriately with due consideration." We also asked students, are you more or less likely to study in the US as a result of the 2020 presidential election? 67% of students indicated that they are now more likely to study in the US as a result of the 2020 presidential election. 27% of students said there was no change to their likelihood to study, and 5% of students said they are now less likely to study in the US. And interesting to note that of the students who said they are now more likely to study in the US, over half of those students said they are much more likely to study in the US. And again, another quote this time from a prospective postgraduate student from Kenya who says, as an international student, I feel much more welcomed compared to past years. So again, this is just a quick preview of the survey results. There are some really fascinating takeaways and insights that will be released next week. If you'd like to receive that press release and the full report of the survey, and if you're not already on our mailing list, feel free to drop your email address in the chat here, and we would be happy to add you to that and make sure that you get that press release when it is coming out. So what are our key takeaways for the US looking to the future? While hope is indeed on the horizon, international student demand is returning to the US. So across our platforms, we are seeing increases in student searches to the US beginning back in November. We're seeing clear effects of geopolitical factors on student demand. There are nuances in terms of source market demand and program demand. So it's important that your institution is tracking real-time student behavior online. And students are feeling optimistic. So the majority are indicating increased likelihood to study in the US following the 2020 election results. So all signs point toward increasing enrollments across US institutions in the years to come. And with that, we will say thank you, and we will take a few questions. Our contact information is here. If you are interested in reaching out with any questions or you'd like to chat following the presentation, please feel free to reach out to Jonah or me.
Thank you, Ellie. I just was trying to scroll through some of the comments and questions while you were talking. Could you just reiterate that China's excluded and just go through why again? Because I think there was one or two people who maybe joined late or weren't able to see that. So if we could just go through that again, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do exclude China from this data because students from China don't use our websites in the same way that students from other markets do. So traffic from Chinese students is typically lower because we know that they rely more heavily on direct relationships with agents, as well as doing their top of the funnel research mostly within WeChat. So the traffic to our sites from prospective Chinese students really isn't rich enough when compared to all of these other countries.
Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Just scrolling here through any questions that have come in.
So it's a really nice, good question there at the end. So these are the pull factors. What about the push factors from sending countries? And I think I can give one straight away off the bat. So at the moment, we've got a very different outlook in terms of where students can study and when they can study face to face. If we look at the Crossroads data that we've carried out those three research throughout the pandemic, we see that face to face teaching is pretty much the number one priority for students, no matter which countries they're coming from and which countries they want to study in. Overwhelmingly, they want to study face to face. It then comes down to the fact that some countries are more open and some countries are less open or completely closed. And in the last research that was published in October, we saw a positive swing in terms of sentiment and perceptions of countries that had remained open during the pandemic. specifically the UK and the US. And we saw a decline in positive perceptions of New Zealand and Australia, and Canada remained pretty much the same as it had throughout the pandemic in terms of those perceptions. So students are really looking to face-to-face, and they're looking to countries that will welcome them and where they can get that campus experience that they want. Additionally, it's really interesting to look at some of the other factors that we've got in terms of quality of teaching. As I said, I've presented on student migration for a long time. The US always comes out #1 in terms of perceived quality of teaching. That's never gone away, and I think that's again coming to the fore at the moment. Canada also, US also does incredibly well in terms of perceptions of individual institutions and the quality of those institutions, which is a complete difference to Canada. Canada, on the other hand, has a magnificent country brand. So students aren't choosing individual institutions in Canada. First of all, they're choosing Canada as a country, where for the UK and for the US, it's very much the opposite. They're choosing the institutions that happen to be in those countries, and UK and US have continued to have okay international student recruitment, even when the policy arena maybe wasn't doing them any favors, because of those individual brands and the idea of high ranking and high quality institutions. And now with the more welcoming atmosphere and possibly a brand USA building back up, I think there's the popularity is riding off the back of that as well.
Yeah, really good explanation, Jonah. Thanks for that. And then I think a lot of these questions seem to have been covered throughout the remainder of the presentation or from our discussion now, but I do see one about visas and how they might affect student demand. So just going to return to this slide, and Jonah, if you could discuss that one more time.
Yeah, sure. So this was looking at demand specifically from India. So Indian students using our sites, and you can see that from late February through till just after the 9th of March, so into the middle of March, a real significant dip in demand for the US, and that's coincides with the WHO declaring the global pandemic, and was a trend that we saw across most of the key destination countries. It then plateaus throughout late spring and summer, and then and this coincides, that plateau, that lower plateau coincides with when India, there wasn't the processing of student and academic visas to the US at that point. And then we see a slow recovery followed by a dip in October, and then coinciding with the election of Joe Biden as president, we see a real rallying of numbers, almost back up to the pre-pandemic levels that we saw back in January last year.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonah. It's fascinating to see how that can affect student intentions and interest in a study destination. And then finally, I just want to address one question I saw come in. Says, and this is in regard to the recent survey that we conducted in relation to the US election, what countries' students are now less likely to come to the US after the election? We are able to dig down and see those insights. And I can also share that there is variation between students' self-reported awareness of US politics and how closely they follow US politics. So we definitely saw some variation in students' likelihood to study and their perceptions of the US, depending on how closely they follow US politics. So very, very excited to share all of those next week when we do publish the full report. So I will certainly be sending to everyone on this list who have included their email addresses. All right, well, with that, I think we will close. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this presentation. And please feel free to reach out to Jonah or me following the presentation. Happy to discuss international student recruitment, our wealth of data, or any other related topics with you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks all. Take care.